Hello, my name is Ingrid Kalwitz Blanco. I am a sophomore at Sweetbriar College, and this past summer I researched school desegregation in Asheville, North Carolina. I had the pleasure to work on my summer honors research with my mentor, Dr. Duana Waugh, that I am so grateful for. And yeah, I hope you enjoy my presentation. So, I want to give a little bit of an idea of why this is so relevant still today. Because in Asheville city schools, white students in grades 3rd to 8th grade are 5.6 times more likely to score career and college ready on final exams than their black counterparts, their black student counterparts. And another thing, in the city, black students are 12 times more likely than white students to receive a short term suspension. These both come from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice in their 2019 Racial Equity Report cards. So, this is super recent, and this is the current situation in Asheville, North Carolina. So, this happens today in 2020, but why? And this is what I researched this summer. And 50 years ago, when African American communities needed to be listened to and their ideas put into plans, school boards, specifically Asheville School Board, and the local government um, failed their students and did not provide the most effective plan to desegregate schools. I decided to add this quote by historian Seidel Walker, and it says, "It wouldn't work over time just to move black children into white schools without also finding ways to extend the pedagogical traditions and professional networks that have supported them. You can't just hand over the children to people who have no knowledge of those traditions and expect everyone to reach his or her highest potential." I think this is so important because it reflects how black schools were extremely important and necessary for students, for their families, and for communities, and closing them had lasting impacts that are still seen today. And you would expect the school board to want all students to reach their highest potential, but without acknowledging the needs, the wants of a community, of a group of students, that is completely impossible. So first, for some context, Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, in which the Supreme Court ruled that in public education, the doctrine of separate but equal had no place. Therefore, separate educational facilities that were unequal were no longer legal in the United States. So, in response to this, North Carolina passed the Pearsall Plan of 1956, which was in theory a solution, but in practice, it was just an excuse to avoid desegregation of schools. It just offered parents and local school boards to have the tools to find legal ways to not integrate their students. This was passed by the General Assembly, and then as a constitutional amendment in a ballot passed with 80% support. So it was very supported by those who were able to vote. So what the plan did was to provide funding in the form of grants for students to apply to private institutions if they did not want to attend public schools that were beginning to be racially mixed. And they also supported referendums in local school districts to close schools completely when desegregation was not feasible. I attached a newspaper clipping that states that the plan aimed at guaranteeing that no child in the state would be required to attend an integrated school against their will. So, in newspapers, this was public knowledge what the plan was intended to do. And in Asheville, it was welcomed with open arms. Asheville lived by this idea of a progressive mystique, in which riots and lawsuits and negative news were avoided. And this was maintained by enacting a pretty early on integration plan in 1961. But as I will explain further on in my presentation, the plan was never fully implemented, and the Black community was never brought into making this plan or putting it into place. So Stevens Lee and the Black community in Asheville were extremely important. On one side, we had the white high school, which was built. It was spent $1 million to be built. And on the other hand, the Black high school was built with not even 10% of that money. So from the very start, they were very unequal. But there's so much more to it that I learned through my research. This school, Stevens Lee, had so much importance for their community because it's so easy to learn about Black spaces and seeing them as inferior and lacking resources, spaces that needed to be saved by white people, but that was not the case. That's just a fraction of reality. There were Black schools that were extremely qualified, were extremely preparing their students. As we can see in the pictures, we have the band of Stevens Lee. It was known throughout North Carolina. Their students were extremely proud of it. There was a documentary made about the school. It was also, for many decades, Western North Carolina's only secondary school for African American students. Students would get bused for hours every day just to go, which is super important. And then on the bottom left, we have an image of the faculty members. 20 of the school's 34 faculty members held master's degrees in education in 1964. So 60% of the overall staff had a professional degree, which is extremely relevant, especially for this time. And not only that, but the school teachers were role models for the students. They were part of their communities. They went to the same churches, lived in the same neighborhoods. It was very family oriented. Unfortunately, in 1965, as part of the desegregation plan, Stevens Lee was bulldozed. It was first closed, and then 10 years later, it was completely demolished overnight without consulting the community at all. I also added another quote, this time by Du Bois, that says, "The proper education of any people includes sympathetic touch between teacher and pupil, knowledge on the part of the teacher not simply of the individual taught, but of his surroundings and background and the history of his class and group." And I think it exemplifies what the Black community had built with limited resources and limited support from the government, but it had built an amazing and resourceful school that supported their students in the way they needed. And this was all lost and never truly recovered. And I believe the history of Stevens Lee is extremely important in understanding why the desegregation process was so faulty in Asheville. So now actually into the process of desegregation in Asheville. Asheville released a 5-year plan just 6 years after the Brown decision in their efforts to desegregate. The plan said that desegregation work would occur from the elementary level up to the high school level starting in 1961 to 1962. There were non-racial attendance zones created as well, which meant that the school district was divided into geographical attendance zones with no regards to race. But it is very important to note that the neighborhoods were already segregated, so this didn't really make a difference. But supposedly it did allow Black students to attend a white school nearby if the school board approved, which it did in most times, as seen in their archives. But it is also very important to note that no white students ever attended any Black segregated schools at any level. There was not even applications for it. So as we can see in the archives that I have in the presentation, in the first year, students from 1st to 3rd grade began to be desegregated. But this consisted of only 6 black students that were sent to Newton Elementary, and each of them was placed into a different classroom. So it was 1 black student with all of their classmates being white. So by placing those 6 black students and separating them into classroom with the other 309 white children, the school was able to say that 63% of their classrooms were desegregated, which is just playing with the numbers, and it wasn't really integrated at all. So token desegregation continued. 24 more students joined the 6 black students the next year, but it was still 7%. In other schools, for example, David Miller Junior High, they only had 53 black students, or 5.7%. And it is very important to consider that Asheville had a 30% black population at the time. So this does not reflect in the way that schools were being integrated at all. In 1966, as we can see on the image on the right, supposedly the last year of Asheville's integration plan, only 2 black students were part of the graduating class of Lee Edwards High School. Okay, so continuing a little bit with the process, in 1969, it was decided that all high school students would go to Lee Edwards High School, the white high school. And South Branch Broad, where all the black high school students were attending, would become the 9th grade school for all students. So in 1969, integration finally became a reality. There was great fight from the community to change the name to Asheville High School, which they did when the 2 schools were consolidated. But what the students did ask for as well was some kind of smooth transition and help, some kind of orientation, counseling, but absolutely no preparation was given to the students or the faculty, which had great consequences. Something very important was that very close to this, excess classrooms began to appear, and the school board then decided to close a number of schools. And obviously, all communities were fighting over which schools they wanted to close because they wanted to keep their schools, the black community as well as the white community. But the school board voted to close the black elementary schools and bus the students into formerly white schools. So in 1960, North Carolina had 248 black high schools, and now in the present, there are only 5 historically black schools remaining. And the sole reason for this tragic consequence is simply the white rejection of these black spaces. So after integration occurred, student protest happened. Only 2 months after the school was integrated, black students shared a list of demands with the administration because they were tired of being discriminated against. And it was things between representation in the cheerleading squad to discrimination and discipline measures. They faced racism in cosmetology against different kinds of hair. There was no quality African American history class. Black students were called nicknames by their own teachers and instructors that were very discriminatory, and so they decided to send a list of their demands to the school, which was not responded to, so they decided to organize a peaceful protest. In response, the police was called, which came with riot gear immediately and demanded the students to leave premises at the time, which ended being remembered as a riot in the newspapers, which does not have anything to do, which was actually organized by the students. And again, in 1972, there was another protest. There was another curfew installed in Asheville, and 8 people were taken to the hospital. Um, so that was my presentation. I learned a lot of things about the local history of Asheville. Something that was very impactful was how little students and local people from Asheville know about this, and I believe it's so important to acknowledge this history and how it is still affecting our communities at large. I believe the school board should act with measures that address issues that weren't solved 50 years ago as they should have been. And students should understand the history of the place they are graduating from. So, yeah, thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.